right, this is section 5. And I think a good question to answer is, are there any scriptural evidence? Is there any scriptural evidence for this issue being, what should I say, being disputed? Is there any do we see anything to suggest that Luther's theory might have had some kind of traction in the first century? And frankly, I think there is. For one thing, Peter, in 2 Peter 3:16, he says something like this. He says, you know, brethren, there's some things which our blessed brother Paul has said in his many letters. He has God's wisdom in writing them. But there are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant distort as they do the rest of the scriptures to their own destruction. So be on your guard. Be watchful, lest you fall from your own steadfastness. I didn't quote that just exactly right, but that's the gist of it. So it makes you think, what things was Peter talking about? Some things hard to understand. Now we know that Paul preached the same gospel. He preached the same gospel as the rest of the apostles. However, as an apostle to the Gentiles, Paul had to deal with the pressure in the first century for Gentiles to have to become Jews, to be saved, or to continue even existing in the community of Christ. And we know that Paul, unlike Peter, unlike James, unlike the other apostles who were Jewish and their main domain was among the Jewish people, he had to deal with this. He had to deal with specifically the relationship between the two living in the same body, the same community, without them feeling the pressure to embrace all, as I said in the other lecture, the Jewish identity markers, the Jewish separatisms that came with what a Jew was in the first century. Well, I think that's what Peter's talking about. He's talking about this very thing. And he knows, because he's, you know, both Peter and Paul are, they die supposedly very close to each other in martyrdom's death. And so he's writing toward the end of his life, and he's certainly aware of Paul's many letters that sent out to the Gentiles. They're read all over the Christian empire. And then there's James. Now James was the bishop in Jerusalem. He wasn't one of the original 12, but he had considerable stature in the early church, and he was essentially the bishop of Jerusalem. And he wrote the book, and it's the most Jewish book we've got in the New Testament, I think, unless the Gospel of Matthew is. And it's just 5 chapters, but he devotes a whole chapter almost to this issue of, is it faith alone, without works, that we're saved by? Just read that chapter. And what you'll discover if you've read Romans and Galatians and some of the way that Paul illustrates some of his issues, Paul refers to the case of, at length, about Abraham and uses it as part of his reasoning. James is referring to the same incident. He's referring to Abraham. And he's saying, and so we can see, brother, just read it. I'm not going to get into it now, but it's an amazing thing because it mirrors so much of the thinking of Paul, but it's almost like a response to it. It's almost like a corrective. Why? Did Paul need any correction? No, Paul didn't need any correction. But some people that were in Christianity, some were taking what Paul said and running with it and taking it out of context because it was, some of the argumentation was hard to understand. And so James says it's not by faith alone. Now, nowhere in Scripture is the word faith alone found except in James. And he says it's not. Is this a strange coincidence? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think, though I don't know, my feeling is that there was some trouble over the way of Paul's argumentation. There were some people taking it out of context and misunderstanding it and reading things into it that Paul did not say. And James offered that as a corrective. Now, just as an aside, Luther was hopping mad about James. He hated the book of James. He wanted to throw James, this is public record, he wanted to throw James out of the canon and tried to do so. And I think the other reformers wouldn't let him. And though I don't really know the background for exactly that, I'm sure there is one, but I don't know what it is. But he made the statement, I would throw Jimmy into the fire. That's, the book, Luther could be quite spirited. But anyway, he was not happy about James. He did not want James in the canon because, frankly, James just out and out contradicted Luther's take on Scripture. Just, anyway. So yes, there is some evidence. There is some evidence of misunderstanding of Paul even in the first century. In fact, Paul himself, in one of his writings, he says, there's some say that because of what we say, that, that we should sin all the more because what difference does it make? And Paul, this is a very brief scripture, but it's in Romans. It's in the first, not sure which book, if it's our first chapter. It's second, third, somewhere in there. Paul says their condemnation is just. In other words, there are people misunderstanding me. So, we'll conclude with that, and we'll take another pass at this next time.